Thanks for having me, and hello to all of you. Some of you I've had the pleasure of meeting, and thanks for coming up and seeing us at the United Nations University previously. I'll tell you a little bit about the project that I'm working on currently, and that is a project examining child trajectories into and out of non-state armed groups that use extreme violence. The terminology is a bit of a mouthful. We're very careful about terminology. We are avoiding some of the terminology around violent extremism. At the same time, you may say, well, what is extreme violence? Which I'll get into in a moment. But we're trying to understand how children are being recruited, abducted, coerced into contemporary non-state armed groups, groups like ISIS, groups like Boko Haram, how they're being used while in the company of these groups, and what their likely exit points are and what they need upon release for reintegration. We're working with our partners in UNICEF, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, the governments of Luxembourg and Switzerland on this project. So that's just in a nutshell sort of what we're looking at. But the goal of this is really to have, at the end, empirics-driven programmatic guidance. There's a lot of work being done in this area, much of it based off questionable assumptions, a complete lack of data, and we want to make sure that when we tell child protection officers in the field about what to do when they encounter a child associated or accused of association with one of these groups, we want to make sure that what we're suggesting is grounded in empirics. And when we can't do that, because there's a likelihood, there's not a lot of great empirics in this space, we want to make sure that we do so in a very thoughtful, in a rights-first manner, and at least we acknowledge we might be in the hypothesis testing phase, and then gather the information necessary to go back and build our knowledge base further. So it's a little bit about our project, and so it's from that perspective that I'll talk a little bit about some of the questions that were posed for this panel. And one is, how do we frame this challenge academically and for policymakers? And I guess I would say carefully. So I think it's very important that we think about the language that we use. We think about the categories of analysis and how they correspond with categories of practice. And that's why we push back a little bit on the violent extremism language. I think we have to be very careful when we talk about causal relationships. In most cases, we don't know a lot about causal relationships. We might have little pieces of data that give us insight into some of the risk factors, but we don't necessarily have enough to establish causation. And in many cases, it's a very complex question about why children or why anyone would get involved with a group that engages in political violence. So I think we need to be very clear about what we know, what we don't know, what we might have hypotheses about. So then asking about how we should do CVE, especially given the very vulnerable population that I'm concerned about, which is children. And I think the first lesson here is your number one priority is to do no harm. There are a lot of people operating in this space, many of them very well intentioned, but they haven't necessarily thought out what their intervention does, or the potential unintended consequences of that intervention. And in the more hardline security sphere, we've seen this a lot with counterterrorism operations where there's been a lot of unintended consequences. But even on what we call sort of the softer side of, quote unquote CVE, PVE, there's often unintended consequences as well. So I think our first principle when thinking about these issues is always do no harm. I think the second one is we really need to think about empirics and also about the causal relationships and assumptions behind our intervention. So it's interesting, often when you talk to people who have spent a lot of time designing interventions, but when you ask them about the causal relationship behind it, so you do A, what is its impact, and what is the outcome we're going to see, they often have a very hard time articulating that. That suggests to me a problem, and that's probably something that should be thought about a lot more before we go into implementation. And a part of this is about language as well. So when we don't actually know or have the empirics to justify the type of intervention that we're planning, In addition to do no harm, we might be in the space of hypothesis testing. So if that is the case, I think we need to be forthright about it, and we need to gather as much impact assessment as possible so that, again, we can sort of build our knowledge base in this area. And the next sort of point of this is about language and being extremely careful about describing the interventions that we do. We see a lot of interventions that talk about everything from increasing leadership skills, building pro-social bonds, self-confidence, a different identity. Some of these things are extremely far upstream, and there's really very little way that we would have to test the impact related to violent extremism. I'm not so sure. We may believe that if you do an after-school soccer program and that program engages young people, it makes them feel part of a community that they had not previously been part of before, if it helps create self-esteem, if it helps promote values like working hard and paying attention to teamwork dynamics, things like that, that we think might be helpful in the long run. But we're not going to be able to test any relationship to preventing somebody from joining a gang or a violent extremist group. I'm not sure why we need to even talk about that. It's so far upstream, it only is going to cause a problem when it comes to creating stigma around the population you're serving. So yes, it might help you in getting funding streams for such projects, but I'm not sure that's necessary. And in fact, in the long run, I think it may undermine the work that you're trying to do. So in my personal capacity, I see a lot of programs that have been relabeled CVE, programs that have been existing for decades, and suddenly they're CVE programs. In many cases, this is development work, this is work dealing with marginalized communities, and yes, it may have a positive impact in that area, but again, so far upstream, not targeted towards necessarily the populations we're concerned about, and ultimately, I think, only undermines its own value by labeling itself as such. So I guess ultimately my suggestions are, when we move in this direction, we have to be extremely careful both in our academic research but also in our policy and programmatic implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan, and underlining the thoughtful nature of how we proceed, I think, is very relevant, given that framing, how we think about countering violent extremism, the language we use, the timing of the initiatives. I know you've done a lot of work in the peace-building capacity, thinking about disengagement, de-radicalization, all of these things, very, very important. Also, when we're thinking of the resolution of conflict, we have to think about what we leave behind in terms of the impact of these initiatives, how they influence the local populations.